I'm showing at NADA right now. I also am the associate editor of Kaleidoscope and a curatorial advisor and writer on the next Venice Biennale. And this is Joseph Montgomery. He is, his work, which could be deemed possibly painterly assemblage, integrates scraps of material into highly tactile, heavily worked formal compositions that seem as if they could have been salvaged from construction sites or factory floors, and is currently showing at Laurel Gitlin's booth at NADA, and will be included in the upcoming group show Painter Painter at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and will be the subject of a solo show at Mass MoCA this May. So, welcome.
Thank you.
And so the title of this panel, which is taken from the title of this new issue of Kaleidoscope, which you can actually find over here on the table and also at a booth in the magazine section, is Painting Forever, which acts as a kind of declarative statement or rallying cry about the state of painting now. But here I wanted to sort of undermine that triumphalist stance and change the title into a question, basically, Painting Forever? It seems that you don't particularly practice painting as such, like in the traditional understanding of painting. So I wanted to ask the first question, which is, are you interested in advancing the dialogue surrounding painting as a medium, or is that a concern that seems outdated? More specifically, I'm wondering if you're interested in painting as such, or the use of painting as a kind of jumping off point to create hybrid forms?
Well, I think that the answer to the question, painting forever, is actually in the positive. It's that painting will exist forever, and my interest in it is that it does, or always will exist in a very mundane way. The action of painting is always going to be an act. It's something that I think about in terms of the monochrome. Mm-hmm. Making a painting can be as simple as putting a color down on a surface. And that physical action, painting, is not something that's going to disappear.
Sure.
Painting in the fine art context that I think you're talking about, painting here in the galleries, in the art world, in the art market, I think also will continue to exist because painters are interested in not necessarily battling painting anymore. I think that from my perspective, those battles don't need to be fought. It's more that you can investigate within the studio different ways of engaging painting, exploring painting, not being defensive or pessimistic about the state of it, but actually more exploratory. And that happens with, different painters have different ways of doing that. But one way is materials, one way is representation. So I think that the answer to the question is affirmative, that painting will go on forever in some way, and that the existence of it within the art world will also stay the way that it is. I mean, in the sense that it's always going to be a medium.
Right.
It's always going to be something that is going to be relevant to an artist because it's so accessible. It's the thing that you can do right away. It's something that you can make physical immediately, and that actionable, that even mundane aspect of it can exist and be accessible for a long time.
And so I think one of the interesting things that you're saying is that now no longer it's about sort of gaining theoretical territory or conquering certain, grand theoretical treatises, but now painting has become a more subjective enterprise, something that that the problems of which are worked out between you and whatever it is you're working, a canvas, or in your case, an agglomeration of materials that you're then painting on. Mm-hmm. I mean, would you say that you feel more free in that regard? Like, as if battles have already been fought and won for you, and this allows you to sort of move forward as your own subject?
Well, I think that one of the reasons the question comes up is that people have battled about painting for so long, or even just the past 100 years, that it seems like all those battles have been fought, and that the painting at this point, less it being the subject, which might even add in subjectivism to it and having certain romantic feelings, it actually becomes an object that can be played with, can be approached without that seriousness or without that burden of history or historicity even, that you have all these things packed into it. You can keep it at a remove because some of those battles have already been fought for you.
Sure.
And that you could approach it as an object, and that object is then what you focus on in the studio. It becomes the more a noun than a verb. It's something that you look at, you discuss, you poke at, you represent.
And so would you consider yourself, I mean, I have heard that you consider yourself very strictly a painter. Or do you think there's a bleed over into sort of sculptural practice as well, because your work is sort of dealing with assemblage as well? Or are you very much, you want to define yourself as a painter?
Well, I very specifically call myself a painter because I think that I am representing painting when I make the objects that I make.
Sure.
And that's why I call it, all their titles are images, and the title begins with image and then the number of the work that was created in the order that they're made. And so each of those things is a painting, but to me it's also a representation of a painting.
Right, and you've done work where you've done paintings of photographs of your paintings, correct?
Right.
Yeah. And how is that important to you? I mean, does photography play a role in your practice, or is it just a sort of one step remove mediation process that allows you to sort of think about your paintings as images?
Well, I think that goes back to what I said earlier about painting being an object. It being something that you see represented that has some defined borders to it already, and that you then use the photograph of the painting, you use the image you see on the screen. All those things are, in a sense, kind of separate it and make it an objective, or add an objective distance to it. And so using photography, calling something an image, all those things reference the fact that you are putting a painting at a distance from you and can look at it more pragmatically, or even, not scientifically, but with a little bit more distance to dissect it or take it apart, hold it to a standard that's less romantic. And I think that photographing work that I've made and then making a painting from that photograph was part of that process. Unfortunately, those things I wasn't as interested in because they actually were too cold of a process.
Okay.
They weren't something that I enjoyed in the studio. They were something that was more of a
It was
project.
more of a theoretical exercise, kind of. And sort of, so moving into another way that you engage with your painting in that regard is, I know that in your last show at Laurel Goodland, you had a piece of marble that you'd found in a stream nearby your studio. Yeah, and which sort of miraculously also seemed to look like some of the paintings that you make. And this is maybe a more romantic engagement with this notion of your paintings as an object. I mean, would you say that that was more successful for you, or is that something that you want to pursue in moving like towards a found object as also a painting? Or
Yeah, I think that the found object is fun because it does sort of you can tell that I'm lying in a way because it is this marble thing and it's attractive to me, and I do have a connection that's not just objective. And the story behind it was that I was working on paintings as I normally do, and my parents live in Vermont, and right after Irene hit in Vermont there was a lot of flooding, and during that flooding one of the rivers, they knocked down the covered bridges and things in southeast Vermont, and for whatever reason these big hunks of marble were dredged up, and either side of the marble are cut marks from a marble quarry that end up looking like the diagonals in what I call the shim paintings. And for me, that discovery is, I don't know, it sounds mystical, but the idea that the painting is predetermined, either that the painting as an object already exists and I'm representing it, or that the forms within a painting that you might make are things that, have it's like sort of like every song has already been written, that sort of scenario. And or I was thinking about it when I was down here for some reason, that painting can kind of sometimes be like fan fiction, that Ian Fleming wrote all the Bond novels, and then people continue to write the Bond novel after the Bond novel is already written, exploring the characters, using the forms, using the storyline, and that painting for me can be that in a way, like that these assemblages, these ways of putting together an image already exist somehow, and that my process of putting them together again is more like just a realization of pre-existing forms. And so the marble was very much a sign of that kind of theory behind making a painting.
And so I know that you actually had that piece of marble cast and then reproduced in bronze, right?
Right.
Would it ever be a thing that you would do as a move to just simply not interact with the found object that you had, or do you need that extra step?
Well, again, I'm a trial and error artist, so the making it again was a way of sort of looking at it from another angle, same way of making a painting of the photograph of the sculpture.
Right.
And again, it was sort of a cold process, but the actual marble was also in the show, and that was, much more. It had more warmth and interest to me there. I think a found painting that's an interesting question for a painter, because I don't think I would allow myself to do that yet.
Right.
But a lot of the materials that are within the paintings themselves come from other paintings, so there's a little bit of it being.
So you dissect and repurpose paintings that you've sort of deemed not real works.
Right.
Okay. And where do you source your materials from to make these paintings? Are they?
Well, the beginning of my work, starting with image number one, was putting things on top of paintings that I deemed too earnest. They were too romantic. They were too sincere almost, and I was embarrassed by them. And they were just simple abstract paintings on panel, and putting something on top of them covered them up, but also created a hierarchy and made it, in general, more visually interesting.
You were like hiding your shame.
I was hiding my shame, and I've always had a problem with earnestness in the studio. It's something that is like, am I being too revealing? Am I trying too hard in a way? And that putting something on top of a painting was the first step in sort of making work that I found relevant. And for a while I made paintings where I fabricated the things that I put on top of pre-existing earnest abstractions. And a lot of those things that I really wanted to put on top of the paintings were elements that sort of felt like fake paint, and I would make those out of clay, Sculpey in particular, and like squeeze it out so it would look like a ribbon of paint, or blend it in a pasta thing so that it looked like paint, like a squeegee painting kind of thing, and then gluing that or adhering it on top of another painting. So you had a real painting and a fake painting, and the fake painting kind of hid the real earnestness of the other one. At this point in the studio, the pieces of things that are stuck onto paintings are all remnants of other paintings or paintings that I destroy and then repurpose. So it's become somewhat of a closed system.
And so are you still afraid of earnestness?
I think so, yeah.
And why?
I don't know. I mean, I think that for me, it's that guy you see on the subway who has the ill-fitting suit that's like going to the job interview that there's something about it makes me uncomfortable in a way that I don't quite understand, but it's something that I react against. It plays an important role in making the thing, because if you make the earnest thing and then react to it, then that gets the ball rolling,
right,
and then the painting begins.
I mean, I'm familiar with this impulse in my own work as well, which was something that I very much was drawn to making these very, very romantic photographs of ruined buildings and these sorts of things very early on in my career, and my work subsequently has been a kind of reaction against that, a kind of like using that thing that I'm interested in but making it more removed. But it's an interesting question to think about why perhaps we might be afraid of earnestness now. I mean, I know this is a sort of dialogue that's been going on at least since the 80s, but it's odd to feel. I mean, clearly we're quite exposed here right now, and we're trying to be earnest. But yeah, I mean, I guess that is it's a productive dialogue that you can create with yourself against your own earnestness, like working against earnestness, but maybe in an earnest way.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in a professional way, in a way to make work. I think that the other issue with earnestness is that I think that when you do something in earnest, that you're always trying to present yourself in the best way.
Right.
And if that were actually to succeed, if you were to make the best painting,
Right, and how could you possibly succeed to do that?
Right, but in theory, if you were able to do it, then
Yeah.
your work would stop. And one of the things that I'm interested in is always having work to do.
Yeah.
And so making the earnest painting or the perfect painting or trying to achieve that all of the time is, I think, a tricky place where you get to the point where you've presented yourself so well that, in theory, this has never happened, but you would present yourself so well that your work would stop.
Right,
Or you would get
you've
stuck.
reached some sort of teleological endpoint, and now painting is finished, and not just for you, but for everyone, perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And that would answer that question in a way that painting forever that would be.
Right, painting would end at
Yeah.
that point. And that sort of brings me, I had a question in here that I will, I guess, stop even referring to these questions. But a question about daily studio practice. And I remember, and it seems like you do have a daily studio practice. And I was wondering if you can talk about, because I remember I saw a talk by Marina Abramovich where she talks about how she thought that an artist should never be like a banker, punching the clock every day at like 9 a.m. And going in and doing that, but that they should be inspired by dreams or visions or these sorts of things, which is great, but which does seem perhaps a little bit too romantic. And I was wondering if there was a lot of inspiration that ends up being played out in your studio practice, or is it really just like an accretion process and a kind of like a working through of the problems that you create for yourself in the studio?
Well, I think it's a number of things. I mean, it is working through, but I'm still working it out. I'm not at the point where I have a set. I think I have the most productive studio practice, the most efficient one, and I'm not sure at what point in an artist's life they've actually figured that out. It'd be an interesting question when the studio becomes efficient, or if it ever should be.
Yeah.
But I do go every day, and I do sit there, but I'm not necessarily productive in the normal sense of making something.
So you're not always working. You're just in
Right.
the studio
Yeah.
thinking about the possibility of working.
Well, I'm reading
Yeah.
or doodling. I mean, I actually feel like I have a bad addiction to my phone because it becomes sort of a crutch in a way to look at something else.
Yeah.
Or, you look at the book. It's just to even take your eyes away from something for a while. And I've sort of started to develop different types of work that can be busy work and then other types of work that are sitting and looking work. But I do think it's important to be there in the environment, to make the mistakes, to make the good moves, the bad moves. And that, again, perpetuates work, which again is what I want to do. I don't want to stop working, because that's sort of the scariest thing about making work, is that if you don't really know how to do anything else in a way that is meaningful to you, that the idea of continuing, perpetuating, making work over and over again, or more and more, trying and trying and trying, that's the sort of thing that...
And there's also a fear that maybe if you stop, you will never start again. Maybe?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I can't...
Well, you're not going to try that, so
No,
that's
no.
hopefully good. I was thinking... I want to ask the hard question. I wanted to talk about the artists that you think about when you're in your studio and that make you want to sort of like bang your head up against the wall. And do you have anybody who you fight with, like in your mind, or is it really just a process of fighting with yourself and making work?
I don't know if I haven't talked to other people about this, but I feel like I don't look at a lot of other work. Contemporary work, and I don't know if it's problematic or not, but I often just don't have it wears me out. For one thing, I get really tired really quickly looking at galleries, looking at art, and that's one thing. The other thing is that I think that engagement with other artists has to happen on a very, very intimate level, and talking with somebody and knowing them contemporarily, and having... I'm going to scratch that whole answer, but
creating a dialogue with a group of your peers, I think, is like one of the most important and most productive aspects of art practice. At least it is for me.
I think art making is really lonely. I mean, for me it is, at least.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a broad dialogue with lots of other artists.
Really?
And I don't know if other people will tell me that the art looks insular and that it doesn't have connections to other people. But for me, I'm not as interested in talking about what I'm doing with other artists all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, occasionally, but I don't have other people over for studio visits very often, and I don't seek out going to other people's studios.
Interesting.
For me, sometimes it's a distraction, and it changes that objectivity that I was talking about in approaching painting.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, something that I've found in the photographic community recently is this like incredibly vibrant dialogue that has sort of, that maybe in some ways coincides with the way that photographers work. Oftentimes is sort of out in the world and in a sort of convivial fashion. And I actually do find that painters do say a lot that they don't have as much dialogue with their fellow painters. And maybe that has something to do with the fact that you find yourself cloistered in the studio and really just working on, because you're working on problems that are very, very much physical. And presumably that's something that can separate you.
Well, I also wonder, in terms of painting, if what we're talking about before, how painting, having sort of gone through so many problematic or iterations and talked about so much, that painters nowadays can be fairly specific in what they're doing in such a way that they're not necessarily have a community of or a dialogue with a broader group of people. Like the dialogue you might have as one type of painter, or the issues that you're interested in are very specific to your studio and to your materials and to what you are trying to make, and that might actually limit the conversation in a way.
Right, so you're having a dialogue with materials and you don't necessarily need to have a dialogue with other artists about that dialogue you're already having, perhaps.
Perhaps, yeah. But I kind of enjoy being in an ignorant place in that way. And I mean, it's sort of bad enough to be involved with a gallery in New York and, being conscious of how the market works with your artwork. Which kind of painting would sell, which kind of painting wouldn't sell. And having that knowledge is almost too much of a burden.
Does that become any determinant in terms of the work that you make?
I definitely think it's in my head. I don't, and I do think it affects things.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I'm not necessarily saying that's a negative thing, but I do think that it's a spur in your, I don't know, it's a thorn in your paw.
Yeah.
It's something that you're aware of. It's a splinter. It's something that nags at you a little bit.
So what kind of paintings in your estimation do sell?
Well, I don't know. I mean, my dealer says that she works really hard to sell my work, that it's a hard thing to sell. But one of the things that I'm interested in is making a multivalent body of work, something that has the work that's more minimal and this work that's more messy collaged, and then work that's larger, smaller, blah, blah, blah. But having a broad, interesting dialogue with different types of painting leads to having different kinds of interest in certain paintings, certain types of paintings.
Right.
And that for me is interesting. I mean, I'm interested in the bigger picture, and I think exhibition-wise, what I'm hoping for is a place where I can show multiple different bodies of work in the same place, and that somebody will get the big idea.
Sure.
Of why all these different types of images are being made in one studio, and that becomes a bigger topic of conversation.
And that becomes a kind of a tremendous risk in some ways, because it could just seem like overly eclectic, but presumably that's the process that you go through every day in the studio, is hewing that down to try and make these connections and sort of not limit yourself, but also not not get bored, but also not get too baggy. I mean, it's a difficult process.
Right.
But I wanted also to ask. I know that we, before we did this panel, we both read the David Josselett article, Painting Beside Itself, which features as a sort of slight theoretical cornerstone to some of the dialogues that are in the new issue of Kaleidoscope. And it's an article that he published in October in 2009, and not to get too academic, he basically talks about painting practice as a kind of network now, where it's not a kind of a cloistered, where it's possibly not a cloistered single object that deals with things like ultimate truth or beauty or all of these sort of capitalized Platonic terms, but which exists in order to create dialogues. But it seems as if, I mean, for me, it looked like you were trying, in your paintings, you're bringing these materials in, which in some ways gives your work a dialogue with a material world outside of simply painting. And is that kind of the everydayness of your materials, or these kinds of things that we could find everywhere, is this something that's very important for you in your work to have the paintings feel like they have a relation to the world? Or do you want to abstract those materials and just sort of make them your own?
I think I want them grounded in the world, and I think we sort of touched on this before, but keeping the capital letter words out of painting, or painting being divergent from that, and having this network that is a little more pedestrian, or it juts into a space. I mean,
it's a little more modest in the same way that you're trying to cover your shame, which so that would make sense.
Yeah, and I think that interest is part of the reason why using a material that you get at Home Depot, or, I mean, there's a lot of concrete artwork made right now. I mean, it's something like using a material, being attracted to a surface, being involved with the pleasure of it, being involved with the kind of the blue collar aspect of making a painting, and the materials that you use. Those things are a network in a way. But I think that in the networking idea is also about putting painting a little distance away from the person, and less of it being subject and more of it being object, framed in a different way, or danced on like Oscar does.
Sure.
Put in a place where it can be, investigated and played with.
I like this notion of the sort of like blue collar work that has to go into making a painting that you vaguely alluded to. I mean, does that mean in a certain way that you would never, in your work, have a painting practice where you would have lots of assistants helping you make your work, or is it very, very important that you always touch and deal with the materials that you're making into your work?
I think it's important. I mean, I think that the artists working with other artists, what I would, the assistant role would be one that, learns a process. I think that from what I've seen in working in galleries and working with other artists, is that the assistant is there to learn something, and that process is more about mentorship, I would think, and that.
But this is not always the case. I mean, there are definitely painters who have, vast factories to make their own work, and that's not necessarily problematic in terms of their practice. But for you, it seems very important to have a kind of hands-on, or even like a guild-like situation if you're thinking about your assistant as a mentorship relationship.
No, I mean, I answered it in that way because that's the way I would imagine it, be more of a mentorship type situation rather than a painting factory. I mean, my wife actually squats in my studio a lot, and she's there. She's sort of doing her own thing, but she is also very much gotten into my head and sort of put things in there. And it's a collaborative process in that regard. I feel like it would be the same way as having an assistant in the studio.
Sure. The painting as factory, though, might actually answer our question of like what paintings do sell sometimes. So let me refer to my sheets again. And well, I was wondering, well, in his absence, if you could talk a little bit about the dialogue that you had with Oscar Murillo, and because I know that there was a show where you were asked to be in dialogue with him, and where your practices kind of intersect.
We had a dialogue because he was having a show at Hillary Crisp, and he emailed me out of the blue to sort of talk about what it was to have a studio practice, and then to move that studio practice into an exhibition space, and to see how that changed the work, see how that changed the person, and what was that process going to be like for them, what they were going through he was going through at that time, and what my thoughts were about the studio as a as a place to make things, as opposed to a place where you show things.
Right.
And most of the dialogue was actually about like very physical knit, like we talked about the different kinds of dirt that was in our studio, and we talked about the different apparatus is that we put things on that we were working on. Like the time I was working in a basement that had very low ceilings, and it was below a bookstore, and the walls of this studio were all fieldstone. They were like, big, clunky, mortared together brown stone. And this studio was, I was squatting in it, and it would flood every once in a while when it rained heavily. And I put shelves on the walls, how I usually work, and lean panels on the shelves. And the sheetrock of this basement never met the wall completely because the rough edge of the stone was there, and the sheetrock had a flat surface. And so this building was a 19th century building. Whatever the way it was decomposing and shifting in time and space, whatever that detritus was, it would fall down through that little crack along the fieldstone walls and then onto the paintings that were on the shelves. And so there was this dirt and detritus that was...
And so you began to integrate that dirt into your work.
Yeah, and it was actually a process where I was making a painting not on a white wall, but on a stone wall, which had plenty of interest of itself. And in that time, the painting had to beat the wall to actually be interesting. Right. So it had to be much more interesting than the wall. It had to be much more interesting than its environment. And I think that was a really great way to make artwork. And I really miss it now because now I have a studio with white walls, and it's kind of boring.
It's easier to beat a white wall than it is to beat a like 19th century stone wall.
Yeah, and Oscar would reply about the work that he was doing, his day job, which I forget what it was, and then also rubbing paintings on the floor and retaining artifacts of that space where he was and being interested in the little things that would get caught there and would actually transfer onto the canvas.
But it seems to me that, the nice thing about your work was that the integration of the dirt and detritus from your studio was more of an accident at first, it seems like, than a deliberate strategy. It was almost like you were collaborating with the space itself.
Well, it was, it sort of comes back to that idea of the Blue Colonist. It was like I didn't really have any other choice of places to work.
Yeah.
And a lot of artists probably would say I couldn't work in this space. I called it the dungeon. And, going into the dungeon and making artwork down there was kind of terrible, but also kind of great.
Yeah.
And I think making those decisions was partially, an accident, but also partially conscious, or allowing it to happen and allowing that network that we were talking about earlier to really come into the paintings, but also the paintings to interact with them. That context really informed how they were made and what they became, what made them good for me.
Yeah. I think that a lot about making good art is actually not necessarily breaking down walls or carving new paths, but working productively within constraints. And that seems to be something that you heavily integrate into your work, or at least initially. Now that you're in a pristine, beautiful white-walled space, do you find it more less constraining and therefore more difficult?
I do. I think that's exactly what happens. It does become less constraining, and that's problematic when we're talking about perpetuating work, is that if it actually interrupts it, but it makes it, in a way it's easier, but then in a way it's really a drag, because you don't have the same resistance. I think about it in terms of weightlifting. You always have to, you're increasing weight when you are in the gym in order to build muscle, and that increasing the resistance is something that is very necessary for there to be progress. But for whatever reason, being in a white-walled studio limits that resistance in a way that I never thought would actually happen. And I'm, dealing with the repercussions. And maybe it becomes its own resistance.
It becomes its own problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, I have to be conscious of that and figure out what changed in the paintings, and then whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And, it asks more questions. It makes more work, which is great.
Yeah, that is good. I don't know how are we doing on time? Anyone? We have 3 minutes? Okay. And so Are there any new avenues that you're going to be exploring for the show at Mass MoCA? Or is it going to be a sort of compendious show of work that you've done in the past?
Well, I mean, the curator very specifically wants 3 of the types of work, which is good because for what I was talking about before, combining them and having them in one space and really showing what it means to have these different types of processes in one space. I think, though, that the one sort of new avenue that I'm going on is actually taking those paintings of the paintings and then degrading them and then collaging on top of them. So it's a jump in scale and it's a jump in dealing with the surface that was earnest, and it combines a little bit of the 3 things. It makes a hybrid in a way, which I've been interested in.
You're kind of trying to dial back the coldness that you said was a problem before.
Exactly.
Which was a sort of like an earnest intellectual coldness, and therefore trying to take that earnestness and complicate it by kind of fuzzing it with. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I'm wondering also if we have any questions, since we've been kind of ignoring the audience while we are. So there's one.
Hi, this is actually a question for both of you. I haven't seen yet the Kaleidoscope magazine, so it's possible you've touched on this topic before. But painting forever, of course, assumes the idea that there's nothing that will ever really stand in front of it. And I have a lot of...
I'm sorry.
No, I have a lot of friends that are working in digital and media art.
Sure.
And so the idea of painting is very much changed in the fact that it's not material anymore and that it's happening now, that people are doing things on the computers or it's all digital based. And I was curious, based on this conversation, you have been speaking mostly about the materiality and the experience of painting, and I wanted to know if that is what you feel will take, that's why painting will always be forever, or if there's another element to it that perhaps will continue to take it forward. I don't know, it's probably not a very clear question.
It's a good question, and something that as a photographer sort of plagues me fairly frequently. I mean, I love photography. I love the kinds of things that I can do with it in the way that allows me to interact with the world. But in some ways, I'm jealous of painters who get to get dirty and get their hands in the material. And I don't necessarily think it's a question of either or. I think it's a question now, and this is a thing that I think you can see everywhere with the kind of eclecticism in the fair or everywhere. It's a question now of both and. And it's like, how then can all of these different media then create productive dialogues within themselves? Like, I have friends now who are working in very sort of ham-fistedly, painterly ways in Photoshop. And that, to me, is something that it just gets more productive. It doesn't get less. But do you have any?
I just think it's always going to be an option. Painting, the process, I think, was what you're talking about, that being the attractive part of it, the experience of actually making painting, that drug is always available, that it's not necessarily going to disappear, but that it is always an option for an artist to use if it serves their purpose. I mean, that would be my answer.
Hello, my name's Pierrette Van Cleve. I am not an artist. I am a museum and curatorial professional. When you work in your studio, I'm hearing about your process with dirt that falls here and this and that and diatrists and shitty conditions and everything that happens. Do you have any consideration around your work in terms of conservation and restoration or any kind of archivalness that might take this work further than, a year before it falls apart and shades off and becomes, nothing but a nightmare? I mean, do you worry about that kind of posterity at all in your work? And are you planning for that as you go along?
I think I'm much more selfish about it than I should be, because I think I'm much more interested in it becoming an image than I am for it to perpetually be an image. But I do take care of, if the thing falls on it, then and I want to keep it there, then I do have processes to make sure it stays there. Or
and a collector who pays a great deal for your work, how do you give them instructions on how to archivally maintain the work so that it has some integrity beyond you know,
Well, that
your
you know,
process?
I don't do that. If somebody has a problem, they can always come talk to me about it. But I haven't had any issues yet, and I think the work from 3 or 4 years ago is still fine today. Yeah, but beyond that was that's as much as my career is like 4 years of painting that are out there.
And I think ultimately, in terms of artists using different materials to explore the parameters of their art, I mean, ultimately, I think it should be a conservator's problem, not the artist's problem. And there are a lot of people who've been doing, I can think of someone, like Dieter Roth with his chocolate heads that are in fact designed to degrade. I'm sure it's a conservator's nightmare, and I'm really happy I'm not a conservator. But I don't think that necessarily, in terms of making art, anybody should be limited by thinking about it for posterity. Are we out of time now? Okay, we're out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And be sure to check out the magazine on the table here and the booth in the magazine section. So thank you.
Hey, David, how are you?
See you.
Nice to see you.
Wait, did you replace?